There was a note inside my granddaughter's ballet shoe. That is where this story begins. Not with an argument, not with a phone call in the middle of the night, not with anything dramatic enough to prepare you for what came after. Just a folded slip of paper, no bigger than a bus ticket, tucked beneath the worn, removable insole of a pale pink satin shoe that had been through more rehearsals than I could count. I would not have found it at all if the seam along the heel had not started coming apart. Fiona would not let anyone touch those shoes in the dressing room. She said she would sort it at home, and then the seam gave way entirely, just as we stepped under the awning outside, the Edinburgh rain coming down in cold gray sheets off the meadows, and I knelt down on the wet pavement the way old women are not supposed to kneel anymore, and I helped her, and my fingers found the edge of that folded paper before my eyes did. I remember thinking it was a receipt, a reminder, something ordinary. Then I opened it. 3 names, 1 street address in Leith, and a date from more than 25 years ago. And when Isla read that first name, my daughter-in-law, who has spent 30 years being the most composed woman I have ever known in my life, the color left her face entirely. She did not cry out. She did not speak. She simply put one hand flat against the stone wall of the building and held herself there. And I watched something shift behind her eyes that I had never seen before and have not forgotten since. I am Moira Campbell. I am 78 years old. I was born in the west of Scotland, in a town that smelled of rain and river and coal smoke, and I have spent the better part of my life in Edinburgh, which smells of history, if you can believe that, and sometimes of sea wind when it comes in hard off the Firth. I taught history at university for 31 years. I retired 11 years ago, and I've filled the time since with books, with long walks along the water of Leith when my knees allow it, with early morning cups of tea at my kitchen table on Warrender Park Road, while the city wakes up slowly around me, and with my family, which has always been the most complicated and most precious thing I have ever tried to understand. My husband Alistair passed 7 years ago. He was a quiet man who loved crosswords and strong opinions about Scottish football and was absolutely devoted to our son Duncan without ever quite knowing how to say so out loud, the way that generation of men so often loved, through presence rather than words, through showing up rather than speaking. Duncan is 57 now. He has his father's jaw and his mother's stubbornness, which is not always a comfortable combination, and he married Isla Mackenzie 30 years ago in a small ceremony at the Greyfriars Kirk, and I have loved Isla from the moment I understood that she loved my son without needing him to be any different from what he was. That is a rare thing. I know that now more than I did then. Before I go any further, I want to stop for just a moment, because I know someone is listening to this right now, and I would very much like to know who you are. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. What city? What country? Is it morning where you are, or is it the middle of the night and you cannot sleep? I read every single comment, and it matters to me more than you might think. If this story is already stirring something in you, leave a like, because it tells me to keep going. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please do, because there is a new story here every single day without fail. And some of them, I believe, find exactly the right listener at exactly the right moment. Now, let me find my place again. Fiona is 32 years old. She is the daughter of Duncan and Isla, and she has been dancing since she was so young that none of us can quite remember a time when she was not. She joined a contemporary ballet company based in Edinburgh 8 years ago, and she has made a career of it, a real career, which in the world of professional dance is not a small thing, it is an extraordinary thing, won through years of discipline and sacrifice and the particular kind of stubbornness that looks from the outside like grace. She is tall and very lean, and she has Isla's dark hair and Duncan's way of going very still and very quiet when something is bothering her. She rehearses 6 days a week at an academy housed in a restored Victorian building just off the meadows, all high ceilings and worn wooden floors and the smell of rosin and old timber. And she was in the final weeks of preparation for what everyone agreed was the most important performance of her career, a new work the company had been developing for over a year, and the pressure was considerable. I do not normally collect Fiona from rehearsal. She is 32 years old. She has a perfectly good car and a perfectly functional arrangement with her fellow dancers, and she does not need her grandmother appearing at the stage door with an umbrella. But that Thursday in November, the rain had come in so hard that parts of the meadows had flooded, and 2 roads near the academy were closed. And Fiona had texted her mother to say she was stranded, and Isla was in the middle of a meeting at the National Library that she could not leave. And Duncan was in Dundee for work, and so it was me. I put on my good waterproof coat, and I drove very carefully through a city that was trying its best to become a river, and I arrived at the academy at 5:30 in the afternoon. The building felt busy in that particular way that performing arts spaces feel busy even when they are winding down, the kind of energy that stays in walls and floors long after the people who made it have gone home. I waited near the entrance while Fiona changed. One of her instructors, a compact woman named Rona Gillespie with gray-streaked hair and the posture of someone who has spent decades correcting other people's posture, came to stand near me while we waited. We had met before at a recital 2 years ago, and she remembered me, which was kind. We spoke about the rain, about the upcoming performance, about how Fiona was dancing beautifully, but carrying a great deal of tension in her shoulders that Rona was concerned about. And then she mentioned, quite casually, the way you mention something that has been sitting at the back of your mind for a while, that for the past several weeks, a man had been standing across the street from the academy on Thursday afternoons, just standing there, not approaching anyone, not speaking. Dressed well, she said, dark overcoat, somewhere between 60 and 70 years of age by her estimation. He would arrive around 5 o'clock, and he would stand near the iron railing along the edge of the meadows, and he would watch the building. Not in a threatening way, she was careful to say that, more in the way of someone who is waiting for a moment of courage he has not quite found yet. And then after perhaps 40 minutes, he would walk away and not return until the following Thursday. I asked if anyone had spoken to him. She said one of the other instructors had waved to him once, thinking perhaps he was a parent waiting for a student, and he had waved back very politely and then left more quickly than usual. She said she had mentioned it to someone at the council offices, but as no complaint had been made and no rule broken, there was nothing formal to be done. He had not been there today, as far as she could tell. The rain would discourage most people from standing outside for 40 minutes, she supposed. I stored this away in the particular way I have always stored unexplained things, quietly, carefully, without yet knowing what to do with them. Fiona came out in her outdoor coat with her bag over her shoulder and her rehearsal bag in the other hand, and she looked tired in the way professional dancers always look tired in November, which is the kind of tired that does not go away with sleep, but only with the performance itself. We made a run for the car, which was a slow run in the case of my 78-year-old knees, and we got in and sat dripping for a moment while the rain hammered the roof. She had not changed her shoes. I noticed because I noticed everything that evening, for reasons I could not have explained at the time. She was still wearing her rehearsal shoes, a specific pair she had been breaking in for the new work, pale pink satin with a soft leather sole, and when I asked why she had not changed them, she said a little quickly that she would do it at home. It was easier. I did not press. We drove through the flooded streets to Warrender Park Road, where Isla had arrived home just before us, still in her coat, her hair damp at the edges, carrying a box of files from the library. We sat in the front room with tea, the 3 of us, and outside the rain continued, and the November dark came down early and complete the way it does in Edinburgh, dropping like a curtain at 4 in the afternoon and not lifting again until 8 the next morning. Fiona sat in the armchair near the window with her legs stretched out and her bag beside her, and at some point she shifted and winced slightly, and reached down to examine the heel of her left shoe. The seam along the back had come away. She pulled at it gently and then sighed the way you sigh at small, inevitable things. I slid off the settee and knelt beside her, not without some negotiation with my joints, and began to look at the damage. The insole lifted slightly where the seam had pulled. I reached in to smooth it back down, and my fingers found paper. I do not know why I pulled it out instead of pushing it back in. Maybe because it was folded too precisely to be accidental. Maybe because in 31 years of teaching history, I learned that something deliberately placed is always worth examining. Maybe just instinct. I have been a historian long enough to know that paper preserved in unlikely places is very often the most important paper of all. I drew it out carefully. A small square folded twice, the paper thin and slightly waxy, the kind of paper used for writing that is meant to last, and I unfolded it on my knee. 3 names in ink, written in a hand I did not recognize. Neat, slightly old-fashioned lettering, the capital letters formed with particular care. Below the names, a street address, Cardenden Road, Leith. And below that, a date written in full, the way solicitors and clerks and people who have learned to be precise write dates. The 14th of March, in a year that was 26 years in the past. I read it twice. Then I said quietly, "Isla, come and look at this." She crossed the room and looked over my shoulder. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she took the paper from my hand. She held it under the lamp. She read the first name on the list, and then she put her hand flat against the wall and held herself there, and the composure she has carried through 30 years of my knowing her simply left her, not loudly, not with tears, just left her the way color leaves a room when the light changes. She said the name aloud, very quietly. Margaret Sinclair. And then she sat down on the floor beside Fiona's chair, which is the only time in 3 decades I have seen Isla Campbell sit on the floor, and she held that note between both hands, and she breathed. The shoe sat on the carpet between us, the seam hanging loose, the rosin-powdered surface catching the lamplight, and the 3 of us stayed very still while the rain kept coming down outside. I do not come from a family that performs its emotions loudly. We are Scottish in the deepest sense of that word, which means we carry things quietly for a very long time, and then find it enormously difficult to explain to anyone why we are carrying them once we finally put them down. My father was a shipyard worker from Greenock who thought that expressing worry was the same as creating it, and my mother was a school teacher who communicated love through action rather than declaration, through a meal kept warm, through a coat laid out, through a light left on. I absorbed this manner of being in the world so thoroughly that I did not notice it as a manner at all until I was in my 30s and trying to understand why certain conversations between myself and the people I loved kept arriving at the same wall. I spent my professional life asking people to look honestly at the past, even when the past was uncomfortable, even when it required admitting that the stories we had told ourselves about our own history were incomplete or outright wrong. I was good at this with strangers. I was considerably less good at it with my own family. And I think this is true of most of us. The historian in me knew that every document is a version of truth, shaped by who wrote it and why and what they chose to leave out. The grandmother in me wanted things to be simple and clear and healed, and the two never quite made peace with each other. What I did not know, sitting in that front room on Warrender Park Road with a folded note in my lap and the rain against the window and Isla's hand trembling slightly as she held the paper, was that this small square of waxy paper was about to give me the opportunity I had been circling toward for 2 decades without ever quite finding the door. The opportunity to understand something that had always been present in my family's life, but never spoken. To understand it not as a historian, not as an outsider, but as a woman who loved these people and had been loved by them and had still somehow managed to miss the thing that mattered most. Margaret Sinclair. I had never heard that name before in my life. And yet Isla's face, when she read it, suggested it was a name that had been present in our family's story for longer than I had been part of it. I reached out and put my hand over hers. She looked at me, and her eyes were full of something I recognized as old grief, the kind that has been stored carefully and kept out of sight for so long that you almost forget it is still living in you until something reaches in and touches it directly. She said, "I thought she was gone. I thought there was no trace left." Fiona had not spoken since I unfolded the note. She sat in the armchair with her ruined shoe in her lap, and she looked at her mother with the expression of someone who is encountering the edges of a story they have always sensed without ever being given its outline. She said gently, "Mum, who is Margaret Sinclair?" Isla was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She was the woman who made it possible for your father and me to stay in Edinburgh when we had nothing. And I never told him. I never told either of you. And I have carried that for a very long time." The lamp hummed. The rain came down. And I held very still, the way I learned to hold still in archives when something important was beginning to show itself through the dust. I want to pause here, and I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever discovered something hidden in plain sight inside your own family? A name never mentioned? A story never finished? A door that was quietly closed before you were old enough to know it had been open? Tell me in the comments, because I think more of you will recognize this than you might expect. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now, because tomorrow there is another story waiting, and the day after that another one, and each of them carries something true at its center. Leave a like if you are still with me. And stay with me, because what Isla told us that night in that front room is only the beginning of what I am going to tell you. The story Isla told us did not come out all at once. It came the way these stories always come when they have been held inside for a very long time, slowly, in pieces, with pauses between them that were as heavy as the words themselves. She said it began in 1996. She and Duncan had been married for 3 years. Fiona was not yet born. Duncan was working as a junior surveyor for a firm that went into administration that winter, taking with it not only his employment, but a significant amount of money the partners had encouraged employees to invest in a company pension scheme that turned out to be considerably less secure than advertised. This was not a unique story in that period in Scotland. It was in fact a very common one. But that does not make it less devastating when it is your story, when it is your rent and your future, and the particular kind of humiliation that comes from having done everything correctly and having it taken from you anyway. They had been living in a flat in Newington, a decent flat by the standards of young couples newly starting out, close enough to the university that Isla could walk to work, and close enough to the city center that they felt connected to something larger than themselves. When the firm collapsed, they had enough savings to manage for perhaps 4 months. Duncan found contract work, but it was irregular and badly paid, and the flat, which had seemed affordable on 2 salaries, now required calculation. Isla was working as an assistant conservator at the library, a position she loved, but which paid modestly, as positions you love often do. Margaret Sinclair was the woman who owned the flat. She was 61 years old at the time. She had been a professional dancer in her youth, a soloist with a company in Edinburgh in the 1960s and early 70s, and she had retired from performance when an injury made continuing impossible and had spent the subsequent decades teaching and occasionally choreographing for smaller companies around Scotland. She had inherited the Newington building from a sister who died childless, and she had converted it into 2 flats, keeping the ground floor for herself and renting the upper floor to tenants she selected with considerable care, favoring young couples with professional ambitions and what she called a certain quality of attention to their surroundings, by which she appeared to mean people who wiped down their kitchen properly and did not let mail accumulate in the hallway. She had watched Duncan and Isla struggle, not intrusively, not in the way of a landlord who presents herself as a friend in order to have an excuse for access, but simply, quietly, with the attentiveness of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the particular posture of people trying not to let anyone see how worried they are. She had not reduced their rent without being asked, because she understood that certain kinds of help are more useful when they do not require the recipient to acknowledge need. Instead, she had done something considerably more complicated and considerably more consequential. She had gone to her own solicitor and arranged a loan. Not a request to a bank, not a formal financial instrument, but a private arrangement, drawn up properly, witnessed and signed, with terms she set herself. The loan was enough to cover 18 months of rent, to allow Duncan the time to find stable work, and Isla the time to apply for a promotion she had been hesitating over because she could not afford to spend energy on ambition while they were managing a crisis. The interest rate was fixed at 3%, well below anything a commercial lender would have offered. The repayment schedule was set at a pace Isla calculated they could maintain without strain, and Margaret Sinclair signed it with one condition. The condition was that Isla not tell Duncan where the money had come from. I sat very still when Isla told me this. Outside, the rain had not lessened. Fiona was very quiet in her chair. I said, "Why? Why did she want that?" Isla said, "She told me Duncan had too much pride to accept help from a landlord, and she was not wrong about that. She said if he knew, he would feel the obligation too heavily, and it would become a weight between them. She said a man who feels indebted to the person he lives beneath is always slightly smaller than he should be. She said she wanted him to feel the relief without the weight." I thought about my son. I thought about the jaw and the stubbornness and the way he has always paid for everything first and argued about the bill second, and I thought, yes, she was right about that. She was completely and entirely right about that. Isla had paid the loan back, every penny, over 7 years, through a separate bank account Duncan knew nothing about. She had told him the money that got them through those 18 months came from a combination of a bequest from a great-aunt and a redundancy payment she had understated when she told him about it. He had no reason to doubt this. The crisis passed. The career stabilized. Fiona was born in 1998 into a household that had by then rebuilt itself on ground that felt secure. And Margaret Sinclair died in 2004, 8 years after the loan, and she died quietly in a hospital in Edinburgh, and Isla attended the funeral alone, telling Duncan she was visiting a colleague, and she stood at the back of a small chapel in the Grange, and she wept for a woman she had never been able to thank properly and whose name she had then spent 20 years not speaking aloud. Fiona said very softly, "Mum, Daddy would want to know this." Isla said, "I know." And then she looked at the note in her hand and she said, "But who put this in your shoe? How did anyone know?" This is the question that changed the direction of everything that followed. The paper was thin and slightly waxy, as I have said, the kind used in older correspondence, in offices that still favored the weight and texture of permanence over the convenience of printer paper. The handwriting was careful and slightly old-fashioned, the lettering of someone who had learned to write at a time when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. The 3 names were written in a column. Margaret Sinclair was the first. Below her name were 2 others I did not recognize, Andrew Patterson, Helen Drummond. The address in Leith was written below them. And the date, the 14th of March, 26 years ago, sat at the bottom of the note like a signature of a kind. I am a historian. I know what documents want. They want to be found. They want to be read by someone who will understand what they contain. And this one, tucked beneath the insole of a ballet shoe belonging to the granddaughter of a woman whose daughter-in-law had spent 20 years carrying a secret, had been placed there by someone who knew exactly what it was, which meant someone else had known Margaret Sinclair's story and had decided, after all this time, that it was time for us to know it too. The mysterious man in the dark overcoat suddenly took on a great deal more weight. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark of my bedroom on Warrender Park Road and listened to the rain diminish to dripping from the eaves, and I thought about the shape of a secret. I have written about this in an academic context, the way silence becomes structural in families and communities, the way the decision not to say a thing can over time become as load-bearing as any wall in a house, so that when it is finally removed, what it was holding up has to be renegotiated from the foundation. I had written about this in relation to Highland clearances, to the silences around poverty and displacement, to the shame of the dispossessed. I had never applied it with quite this intimacy to my own household. What Ela had carried for 20 years was not dishonesty in any simple sense. It was an act of protection shaped by love and by a promise made to a woman who was now gone and could not release her from it. And yet the secret had required maintenance. Every year it had to be tended, kept from sprouting into view. That requires energy. That requires a portion of yourself that cannot be given elsewhere. And I thought about Isla over the 30 years of my knowing her. Always composed, always careful, always the one who managed the emotional temperature of every room she entered. And I wondered how much of that composure had been the work of carrying this particular thing without showing the strain. I got up at 5:30 and made tea. I stood at my kitchen window while Edinburgh went from black to grey outside, and I made a decision. The note was information. Information came from somewhere, and in my experience, information placed deliberately in the path of specific people is an invitation. Someone wanted us to find this, and I intended to find out who. By the following morning, the rain had passed, and Edinburgh looked washed clean and exhausted, the way the city always looks after weather has had its way with it. The stone buildings a shade darker along their lower courses, the pavements carrying that particular grey sheen that reflects the sky in broken pieces. I walked to the end of Warrender Park Road and stood for a moment looking toward the meadows, which were still soft underfoot but no longer flooded, and I felt the particular quality of attention that comes to me when I am at the beginning of something. I had felt it at the opening of archives. I had felt it on the first day of research for each of the 3 books I published during my career. A sharpening of something behind the eyes, a sense that the ordinary world around me contains more information than it usually reveals, and that if I move carefully enough, I may be able to read it. I rang Duncan that morning. Not to tell him what I knew, not yet, because that was not my decision to make, but to establish where he was and when he would be home from Dundee. He said Friday evening, he thought, perhaps Saturday morning. He sounded distracted in the way men of his generation sound when they are trying to manage several professional concerns at once and do not wish to appear to be doing so. I said it was nothing urgent, I simply wanted to know his schedule. He said, "All right, Mum," in the particular tone that means he believes me, but is noting the precision of the question for future reference. Duncan is his father's son in many ways, but he is also mine in ways he has not always found comfortable. Isla came round at 10 with Fiona. Fiona had a rehearsal at noon, and so we had 2 hours, and we sat at my kitchen table the way we have sat at 1,000 important moments, with tea and the window and the grey morning outside, and we talked about what to do. The note was on the table between us. I had looked at it again in better light, and had confirmed my original impression of the paper. It was high-quality correspondence stock, the kind used by law firms in previous decades, before digital records made physical paper feel ceremonial rather than functional. The ink was blue and slightly faded at the edges of the strokes, suggesting it had been written some time ago and stored in conditions that were not ideal for preservation. Perhaps a drawer, perhaps a file, somewhere without consistent temperature or light. I said I thought we needed to approach this from 2 directions simultaneously. The note contained names, an address, and a date. All of these were verifiable facts. Andrew Patterson and Helen Drummond meant nothing to any of us, but they were named alongside Margaret Sinclair, which suggested a connection. The address in Leith might still have a traceable history through property records or electoral rolls, and the date was specific enough to narrow any archival search considerably. I said I thought we should contact Police Scotland, not because we believed any crime had been committed, but because if the note was connected to an estate or a legal matter, having an official inquiry on record might help unlock information that would otherwise be restricted. And I said we should also contact a solicitor, specifically one with experience in estate and family trust law, because the shape of what Isla had described, a private loan arranged with formal documentation through a solicitor, suggested that Margaret Sinclair had been dealing with someone in the legal profession, and that documentation might still exist somewhere. Isla listened to all of this with her hands flat on the table. Then she said, "There is something else. Something I did not say last night." She looked at Fiona, then back at me. The solicitor who drew up the loan agreement. His name was Andrew Patterson. Neither of us spoke. She said, "He retired years ago. I do not know if he is still practicing. I do not know if he is still alive. But his name on that note is not a coincidence. I have spent enough of my life studying the shape of coincidence to know that it is almost never what it appears to be. Documents do not place themselves. Names do not gather on paper by accident. The note had been put inside Fiona's shoe by someone who knew what it meant. Andrew Patterson, retired solicitor, whose name appeared both on a 26-year-old loan agreement and on a note hidden in a ballet shoe, was either the person who had placed it there or was the key to finding that person. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know someone listening to this right now has their own Andrew Patterson, their own name from the past that carries more weight than it appears to at first reading. The person who helped when no one else did. The person whose role in your family's story was never properly acknowledged, whose name was kept in a drawer instead of spoken at the table. If that is true for you, tell me in the comments. I would genuinely like to know. And if you have a friend or a family member who carries a story like this one, would you consider sharing this with them today? Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right moment. Subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like if you are still with me. There is a new story here every single day. Now let me continue. Before I describe the inquiry that followed, I want to tell you who I was before I became the woman capable of conducting it. Because my ability to do what I am about to describe did not come from nowhere. It came from a life. And the life matters. I was born in Greenock in 1946, the second of 4 children, the daughter of a man who built ships and a woman who built the household around him with equal skill and considerably less recognition. We were not poor in the way that means not eating, but we understood the value of money the way that children understand the value of things they have watched their parents work very hard for. My father was intelligent in the way that certain men of his generation were intelligent, quietly, practically, without the kind of credential that society recognized as intelligence. And I knew from the time I was very young that this had cost him something he never named, but never entirely stopped feeling. I was the one in the family who went to university. Not the first in the extended family. My mother's brother had gone to Glasgow in the 30s, but the first of my father's children, and I did it on a scholarship, which meant I arrived in Edinburgh in 1964, carrying a single suitcase and an enormous awareness of exactly how much I was expected to justify this opportunity. I studied history because I wanted to understand how the world had become the way it was. I stayed in history because I discovered that the past was not actually the past at all, but simply the present, wearing older clothes, and that understanding it was the closest thing to a map of human behavior that I had ever found. I married Alistair Campbell in 1971. He was a structural engineer with a dry sense of humor and a real capacity for patience, which balanced my own temperament rather well. We had Duncan in 1967 before we were married, which in 1967 in Scotland was still the kind of thing that required management, that required the deployment of certain stories told to certain relatives and a great deal of quiet practical organization by my mother, who managed the whole thing with the competence and emotional compression of someone fielding a minor domestic emergency rather than the complicated situation it actually was. I have thought about that a great deal over the years. About what it cost her to carry that management so lightly. About what she put away in order to appear capable. I tell you this because it is relevant. I am a woman who grew up understanding that there are things families hold in silence, not from dishonesty, but from love, from the desire to protect, from the calculation that certain truths cause more damage in the telling than in the keeping. I understand this at a cellular level. And I also know, because I have lived long enough to see how these calculations play out over generations, that the protection often outlasts its purpose. That what was held in silence for good reason in one decade becomes a weight no one intended to impose in the next. That the people doing the protecting and the people being protected are sometimes protecting each other from the same thing without either side knowing the other is there. Alistair and I lived in Edinburgh for 50 years. We built a life in the city that absorbed us completely, the way Edinburgh absorbs people, slowly and permanently, through its stone and its weather and its particular quality of requiring you to earn your affection for it before it gives you anything back. Duncan grew up here, married here, and raised Fiona here, and all of us have lived within 1.5 miles of each other for the better part of 3 decades, which is simultaneously a comfort and an occasional complication. Families that live close together have access to each other that distant families do not, and access is not always the same as understanding. But I was a historian, and historians do not wait for the story to arrive, they go and find it. I rang Police Scotland's non-emergency line on Friday morning and explained the situation as clearly as I could, which was not entirely easy because the situation was not, at its core, a matter for the police in any urgent sense. But I explained that we had found a document that may be connected to a deceased person's estate, that the document contained names and an address and a date, and that we were uncertain whether there was an outstanding legal matter connected to it. The officer I spoke to was helpful in a carefully limited way, taking down the details and noting that if the matter related to estate documentation, a family solicitor would be the more appropriate first point of contact, but that if we wished to confirm whether any report had been made in relation to the address in Leith or to the names provided, a formal request could be submitted and reviewed. I submitted the request. I was told it would take several days. I then rang a solicitor, not at random. I rang a firm on George Street that a colleague of mine from the university had used in a matter involving her late husband's estate, and I asked to speak to someone with experience in historic trust and estate documentation. I was put through to a woman named Frances Cairn, who sounded somewhere in her mid-40s, and who had the particular quality of attention of someone used to receiving information without performing a reaction to it, which is exactly the quality you want in a solicitor when you are explaining something unusual. I described the note. I described what Isla had told us about Margaret Sinclair and the loan and the solicitor named Andrew Patterson. Frances Cairn asked several precise questions and then said she thought she could help and could we come in on Monday. We could. In the meantime, I went to the National Library, not in my capacity as Isla's mother-in-law, but in my capacity as a retired academic with 40 years of experience in historical research, which means I know exactly how to find what I'm looking for and exactly how to be quiet about doing it. Isla had colleagues there, and I did not want her professional situation complicated by association with a personal inquiry, and so I went on my own on Friday afternoon, the light already going at 3:30, and I sat at one of the long reading tables and I began with what I had. The Edinburgh electoral roll and associated property records are available for research purposes going back decades. The address in Leith, Cardendon Road, was traceable. The property had been registered in the name of a trust as of the date on the note. The trust's name was Sinclair Drummond, which stopped me entirely for a moment because Drummond was the third name on the note. Helen Drummond. I wrote this down very carefully. The trust had been administered through a law firm whose name I noted. The firm had merged with a larger practice in 2011. The larger practice still existed. I sat back and looked at what I had. Margaret Sinclair, who had been a dancer and a landlord, and a woman of quiet, extraordinary generosity. Andrew Patterson, who had been her solicitor. Helen Drummond, whose name was part of a family trust connected to an address in Leith. A note hidden in a ballet shoe belonging to the granddaughter of the woman whose daughter-in-law Margaret Sinclair had helped. and a man in a dark overcoat standing outside a ballet academy on Thursday afternoons for several weeks, not approaching anyone, simply watching. I am not a woman who frightens easily. I spent 31 years in a profession that requires you to sit with uncomfortable information and resist the impulse to resolve it before you understand it. But I am also a grandmother, and a grandmother's understanding of a situation always runs parallel to the academic one, always warmer and more urgent. And I will admit to you that sitting in the reading room of the National Library on a Friday afternoon in November, watching the light fail outside the windows and the other researchers bent quietly over their work, I felt the shape of something both larger and more personal than I had anticipated. This was not just a historical mystery. This was my family. This was Isla's 20 years of quiet carrying. This was Fiona's shoe, worn through 100 rehearsals, holding a paper from the past as if it had been waiting for exactly the right moment to surface. I thought about Margaret Sinclair. I tried to imagine her. 61 years old in 1996, which meant she would be in her late 80s now if she had lived, which she had not. A dancer in her youth, which in Edinburgh in the 1960s meant something specific, a particular cultural world of small companies and ambitious programming on limited budgets. A world that valued excellence without always being able to properly compensate it. A woman who had managed property, who had dealt with solicitors, who had arranged a private loan for a young couple she barely knew, and asked only that her name not be given credit for it. A woman who had, at some point, also been connected to something in Leith, to a trust that bore two family names, to documents that were apparently still unresolved more than 2 decades after her death. Who was she really? And who had known enough of her story to place a note inside a ballet shoe? I packed up my notes and walked back through the Friday evening streets toward Warrender Park Road. The city was in its post-work movement, people walking quickly with their collars up, buses going past in the particular Edinburgh way that suggests they are operating on their own private schedule, independent of any published timetable. I stopped on the corner near the Meadows and looked across toward the Ballet Academy building. The lights were on inside. Through the tall Victorian windows, I could see the movement of people, dancers working late, or instructors marking notes on clipboards, the late rehearsal energy that fills a building in the weeks before a major performance. And on the pavement on the far side of the road, near the iron railing, standing very still in a dark overcoat, was a man of perhaps 65 or 70 years of age. He was not looking at the building. He was looking at me. When our eyes met, he did not flinch, and he did not leave. He held my gaze for a moment with an expression I could not quite name at that distance. Not threatening, not guilty. Something quieter than either of those things. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone who has been waiting a long time to encounter the particular person they needed to encounter. I crossed the road. He did not move as I approached. Up close, he was tall, white-haired, with a quality of formal bearing that suggested someone accustomed to professional dress even in retirement. He was wearing a suit beneath the overcoat. His shoes were polished. He held a leather briefcase at his side, old, well-maintained, the kind of briefcase that has been in use for decades. I said, "I believe you have been coming here for some weeks." He said, "Yes, I apologize." I was trying to determine whether the time was right. I said, "The time for what?" He said, "To return something, to the right person. I have been uncertain who the right person is." I said, "My name is Moira Campbell. My granddaughter dances in that building, and I found a note in her shoe yesterday evening." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something in his expression that looked very much like relief. He said, "Then I believe you may be exactly the right person after all." His name was Robert Mackay. He was 68 years old. He had spent his career as a legal executor, a specialist in the administration of estates and trusts, and he had retired 4 years ago from a firm on Dundas Street. He had known Margaret Sinclair. He told me there on the pavement with the cold coming in off the Meadows, not personally in any close sense, but professionally. He had been appointed executor of a small family trust she had established in the 1990s, a trust connected to a property in Leith and to certain financial documents she had wanted preserved but not immediately disclosed. The trust had a specific condition attached to its dissolution. It was not to be wound up until the beneficiaries could be identified and confirmed, and one of those beneficiaries was the daughter-in-law of a woman named Isla Campbell, who had received a private loan through a solicitor named Andrew Patterson and had repaid it in full over 7 years, and whose name appeared in a sealed letter Margaret Sinclair had left with specific instructions. He said he had spent the better part of 2 years trying to locate Isla Campbell through appropriate channels, not approaching her directly because the terms of the trust required that the documentation be presented properly, through a solicitor in a formal setting. But the address he had been given was outdated, and the phone numbers were no longer in service, and he was, by his own description, not the sort of man who found it natural to insert himself into situations without an invitation. He had begun coming to the Ballet Academy because he had found, through entirely public means, a program from a performance 2 years ago that listed Fiona Campbell as a member of the company. And he had deduced from the family name and the Edinburgh address that this might be a route to the right family. He had been trying, for 5 weeks, to determine a way to approach that would be appropriate and not alarming. He had placed the note in Fiona's bag himself, in a moment of what he called administrative improvisation, slipping it through a half-open dressing room door during a rehearsal break when he believed the room was empty, not knowing it had gone into the shoe rather than the bag. I stood very still while he told me all of this. Then I said, "What does the trust contain, Mr. Mackay?" He reached into the briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope. Heavy paper, cream-colored, bearing a law firm's stamp from a practice that had since closed. He held it out to me. He said, "The final letter, written by Margaret Sinclair before her death. She asked that it be read by the family together. She asked that no part of it be summarized or described in advance. She believed that the whole story deserved to be heard all at once." I took the envelope. It was lighter than it looked, the way important things often are. I thought of the note in the ballet shoe, of Isla's face in the lamplight, of the shape of a secret that had been waiting 20 years for a door to open. I said, "Will you come with us on Monday?" "To the solicitor?" He said, "I was rather hoping you would ask." We walked together as far as the corner, and then he raised his hat, which is not something people do anymore, and which moved me in a way I had not expected. And he went one way, and I went the other, and I carried the envelope back to Warrender Park Road through the cold Edinburgh evening, and I sat with it on my kitchen table for a very long time before I rang Isla and told her to come. The envelope sat on my kitchen table all of Friday evening. I had placed it near the lamp, not in the center of the table where it might seem to dominate the room, but to one side, near the salt cellar and the small clay pot where I keep pens and a pair of scissors and the other ordinary things a kitchen table accumulates over decades. I made soup. I ate it standing at the counter because I did not want to sit across from that envelope and have it watching me while I tried to eat, which is not a rational thought, but is an entirely honest one. Then I made tea, and I sat down and I looked at it. Margaret Sinclair had sealed this letter before her death in 2004. That meant it had been sitting in a law office somewhere in Edinburgh for more than 20 years, waiting. The trust had been maintained by Robert Mackay through his firm, the terms clear, the purpose fixed, the dissolution conditional on the right people being found. 22 years is a long time for a letter to wait. It is long enough for the person who wrote it to become legend in the minds of the people it was written for, long enough for a story to calcify into silence, long enough for a woman who did something extraordinary to become simply a name not spoken, a chapter closed before it was finished. I did not open it. She had asked that it be read together, and I intended to honor that. But I held it, and I thought about the weight of deliberate things. A note folded and placed with care. A letter sealed and entrusted with instructions. A man in an overcoat standing on a pavement for 5 weeks trying to find the right moment. All of these were acts of patience in service of something that mattered. I respect patience. I have not always practiced it, but I respect it enormously in others. Isla arrived at 8. She had left Fiona at home with instructions to rest her ankle, which had been showing signs of strain that the company physiotherapist was monitoring, and she came to my door looking as she had looked since Thursday evening, like a woman carrying something she is finally ready to put down, but is not yet quite sure of the ground beneath her feet. I made more tea. I showed her the envelope. I told her everything Robert McKay had told me, standing on the pavement in the cold with the Ballet Academy lit up behind him. She listened without interrupting, which is a thing Isla does when the information is very significant, goes entirely still and lets it arrive. When I finished, she said, "He put the note in the shoe by accident." I said, in a manner of speaking, he meant it for the bag. The shoe was adjacent. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood as one. She said, 22 years, and it arrived in a ballet shoe. I said, "Things arrive when they are ready. I have always believed that." She looked at the envelope for a long moment. She said, "I am afraid of what it says." I said, "I know. But I think you have been afraid of what it says for 20 years, and you have been carrying that fear along with everything else. Whatever is in there, Isla, it is lighter than what you have been carrying." She put her hands around her mug. Outside, a car went past slowly, its headlights sweeping the ceiling. She said, "I never told Duncan because I could not find a way to begin. At first, there was the promise to Margaret. And then the loan was repaid and it was over, and I thought, what purpose does it serve now? What do I gain by telling him? What does he gain? And then more time passed, and the not telling became its own structure. Do you understand what I mean?" I said, "I have written 3 books about exactly that phenomenon. I understand precisely what you mean." She smiled, just slightly, and the composure that I have always admired in her showed itself for what it actually is, not coldness, not distance, but the effort of someone who has been managing a great deal for a very long time and has become very skilled at making that management invisible. Duncan came home Saturday morning. He arrived in his car with the particular quality of absence that men have when they have been working hard away from home for several days. Slightly dimmed, slightly elsewhere, needing the ordinary rituals of his own house to restore him. Isla met him at the door, and I know from what she told me later that she had decided in the night that she was going to tell him. Not everything, not yet, not before Monday when we would all sit down together with Francis Cairn and Robert McKay and the letter. But the shape of it, the outline. That there was something she had needed to tell him for a long time, and that the time had now come. He sat in their kitchen on Marchmont Road, which is 15 minutes' walk from my house, and which has the same quality of accumulated life that I recognize in my own home. The photographs and the books and the particular arrangement of objects that reflects not design, but the slow accumulation of a shared existence. And Isla told him about Margaret Sinclair. About 1996. About the loan and the promise and the 7 years of repayment. She told me later that he said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "She did that." Not a question. A statement. The way you state something when you are learning it and filing it at the same time. Then he said, "And you carried that alone for all these years." Isla said she started to explain, and he stopped her. He said, "I am not angry. I want you to know that before anything else. I am not angry. I am trying to understand what that must have been like for you. I have raised a son who can say that to his wife in that moment. And I want you to know that I took no particular credit for it when Isla told me. Because children do not learn emotional intelligence from their parents alone. They learn it from their marriages and their friendships and their own private reckoning with who they want to be. But I was grateful. I was very grateful. Before I continue, I want to stop for a moment and speak to you directly, because I think this part of the story touches something that many of us carry and rarely discuss openly. The weight of a secret kept not from selfishness, but from love. The decision to protect someone from information that might burden them, and the way that decision, made once with the best of intentions, can over time become a wall neither person is quite sure how to dismantle. If you have ever been on either side of that, the one who kept the secret or the one who did not know there was one, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Leave a comment. Tell me what that experience has been like. And tell me where you are watching from, because I think this story is reaching people in a great many different places right now. Leave a like if you are with me. Subscribe if you have not yet. There is a new story here every day. And now, let me take you to Monday morning. Frances Cairn's office was on George Street, on the second floor of a Georgian building that has been legal chambers of one kind or another for the better part of 150 years, which I noted with the professional appreciation of someone who finds this kind of continuity genuinely satisfying. The staircase was wide, and the ceilings high, and the waiting room had the particular quality of careful quietness that suggests rooms where important things are regularly said and carefully contained. We arrived at 10 in the morning, the five of us, myself and Isla and Duncan and Fiona, who had been told the full story the night before and had sat through it with the expression of someone rearranging a room they thought they knew completely, and Robert Mackay, who arrived 2 minutes before us in his dark overcoat and his polished shoes, carrying the leather briefcase. Frances Cairn met us herself. She was exactly as she had sounded on the telephone, efficient and attentive and in possession of a quality of stillness that I associate with people who are very good at their work. She had a paralegal with her who took notes, and she had arranged for tea to be brought in, which I appreciated more than was perhaps proportionate, but which struck me as an act of thoughtfulness from someone who understood that this was not merely a legal proceeding, but a human one. Robert Mackay presented his documentation first, the trust records, the executor appointment, the correspondence history tracing his attempts to locate Isla Campbell over the preceding years, the note about the Leith property and its current status. He was thorough and precise, and in some ways, the formal presentation of all these documents was itself a kind of revelation, the way it mapped the shape of something that had existed invisibly for 2 decades. A structure of care and intention built by a woman who would not live to see it arrive. Then Frances Cairn asked whether the family was ready to hear the letter. We said we were. She opened the envelope. She put on reading glasses. And she read, "I am going to tell you what was in that letter. I am going to tell you as faithfully as I can because I think it deserves to be told faithfully. And because I promised myself in that room on Monday morning that I would not let it become abbreviated, would not let it become a summary when it deserved to be a story. But I want to pause first, because what came before the letter is as important as what was in it. And I want to make sure you have all of it before I bring you to the room. Margaret Sinclair was born in Edinburgh in 1934. She was the younger of 2 daughters of a master bookbinder named Thomas Sinclair and his wife Catherine, who had been a seamstress before her marriage. They lived in Leith, which was at that time a separate burgh from Edinburgh, with its own council and its own character, a working port with all the life and roughness and colour that a working port contains, and the Sinclair family occupied the upper floor of a tenement on Cardendon Road, which was the address on the note. The property had been in the family since the 1890s. Thomas Sinclair died in 1951, when Margaret was 17 and her sister Helen was 22. Helen Sinclair married a man named George Drummond in 1953 and took his name, which is why she appears in the documents as Helen Drummond. The 2 sisters were close in the particular way of sisters who have been left by early grief to look after each other, and they remained close throughout their lives, even as their circumstances diverged. Helen into a conventional marriage, and a house in Morningside, and a quiet life of considerable domestic competence. And Margaret into dance and performance and the irregular, brilliant life of the professional artist. Margaret danced with a company in Edinburgh through the 1960s and early 70s. She was, by all accounts, she encountered later in her research into this part of her own history, a significant talent, Not a principal, perhaps, but a vital and committed company member whose technical precision and musicality were consistently remarked upon by critics of the period. She retired from performance in 1973 following an injury to her left hip that never fully resolved. And she transitioned, as many dancers of her generation did, into teaching, which she did with a rigor and warmth that produced several generations of Scottish dancers, at least two of whom went on to careers at the national level. She never married. She did not appear, from anything anyone said or wrote about her, to feel that this was a deprivation. She had her work and her students and her sister and the Edinburgh life she had built around herself, and she had a quality of self-sufficiency that the letter itself acknowledged directly, with a somewhat dry reference to the fact that she had always been better at giving help than receiving it, which she attributed to a stubbornness she inherited from her father and declined to apologize for. When Catherine, their mother, died in 1988, the Leith property passed to both sisters equally. Helen was by then a widow, George Drummond having died in 1985, and she had no children, which meant that when Helen herself died in 1992, her half of the property reverted to Margaret. And Margaret, who by that point was 68 years old and living in the flat in Newington that she had owned since the 1970s, found herself in possession of a Leith tenement she did not need and a sister's absence she had not yet learned to accommodate. She established the trust in 1994. Her solicitor was Andrew Patterson, who had handled her affairs for 20 years and who, according to the letter, was a man of great precision and very little sentimentality and was therefore exactly the right person for the work. The trust held the Leith property and certain financial instruments she had accumulated over decades of careful living, which were, when the letter was written, of modest but not insignificant value. The purpose of the trust was not immediately specified in its founding documents, which was unusual and which Patterson had pointed out with appropriate professional concern. Margaret had told him she would provide the purpose in a sealed letter to be held with the trust documents and opened only under the conditions she would specify. He had complied because he was a good solicitor who understood that his clients were sometimes in possession of better judgment than he was about the nature of their own intentions. Patterson had died in 2009. The trust had transferred to his firm, and then, through the firm's subsequent merger, to the practice where Robert Mackay had encountered it. Mackay, reviewing estate files in his final years before retirement, had found the trust and had found it still open, its conditions unmet, its letter unread, and had taken it upon himself to find the beneficiary named in the founding documents and return what had been held in waiting for so long. The letter. Francis Cairn read it in full, and I will not pretend there was a dry eye in the room by the end, including the paralegals, which she managed with great professionalism. The letter ran to 6 handwritten pages. Margaret Sinclair wrote as she apparently lived, directly and without unnecessary ornament, and what she said was this. She said she had watched Duncan and Isla Campbell in the flat above her for 3 years before the crisis of '96. She said she had not watched them with any intrusive intention, but simply because she was the woman downstairs, and the woman downstairs always knows more about the household above than the household above imagines. She said she had observed 2 young people of obvious intelligence and good character building something solid together, and she said she had recognized in their situation something she had seen in her own life at a similar age, the precariousness of a beginning, the terrible vulnerability of the moment before things have taken hold, the ease with which something fragile can be broken simply by the wrong coincidence of timing. She said she had arranged the loan through Andrew Patterson because she had learned over decades that money given without structure was money that created obligation, and obligation created imbalance, and imbalance damaged the very thing she was trying to preserve. She had set the interest at 3% because she was not a philanthropist. She was precise, and she wanted Isla to feel the full satisfaction of paying it back properly rather than the complicated guilt of accepting a gift. She said she had asked Isla not to tell Duncan because she had heard enough through the ceiling to know the kind of man he was, and the kind of man he was would carry a debt to his landlord like a stone in his shoe and would not be comfortable in his own home until it was paid. Then she wrote the part of the letter that stopped the room entirely. She said she had a condition attached to the trust. The property in Leith, her parents' home, her sister's home, the building where the Sinclair family had lived for 3 generations, was to be held by the trust until her executor could confirm that Isla Campbell's family knew the story in full. Not the financial transaction, the whole story. Because there was a whole story, and the financial transaction was only its surface. She said that her sister Helen had not, in fact, died without descendants. She said that in 1955, Helen Drummond, 2 years into her marriage to George, had given birth to a daughter. The daughter had been given up for adoption, under the conditions that prevailed in Scotland in 1955, which is to say under conditions that gave the mother very little choice and even less comfort. Helen had never spoken of this publicly. George had known and had kept the confidence for the rest of his life. Margaret had known and had kept it for hers. The daughter's name at birth had been Catherine, after their mother, and she had been placed with a family in Aberdeen, and that was the last Margaret knew of her until 1993. In 1993, a woman had come to the door of the Newington flat. She was in her late 30s, she had the Sinclair jaw and the Sinclair eyes, and she introduced herself as the daughter Helen had given up in 1955. Her name was now Anne. She had found Margaret through the adoption records that had recently become available to adult adoptees in Scotland, and she had found her too late to find Helen, who had been dead for a year. She had not known about George's death. She had not known anything about her biological family beyond the names recorded in the original paperwork. Margaret had invited her in. She had made tea, and she had spent an afternoon telling Anne everything she knew about Helen Drummond, who had been Helen Sinclair, the seamstress's daughter from Leith, the woman who had loved her enough to give her to strangers because the world in 1955 did not offer any kinder options. Anne had returned several times in the months that followed. They had, by Margaret's account in the letter, become careful friends, feeling their way toward a relationship that had no name and no template, the aunt and the niece meeting for the first time with decades already behind them. And when Margaret established the trust in '94, it was with Anne in mind. The Leith property was to go to Anne, Helen's daughter, the rightful inheritor of whatever remained of the Sinclair family's material legacy. But Margaret had one further condition, which was the one that explained everything. She said she had wanted Anne to know the whole story before she inherited anything, not just the property, not just the dates and the documents. She wanted Anne to know that her mother had loved her. Not abstractly, not as a formality, but specifically, painfully, permanently. She said Helen had talked about the daughter she had given away for the rest of her life, not in public, not to anyone beyond Margaret and George, but privately, consistently, with a grief that never fully resolved. She said Helen had kept a journal from 1955 until her death in which she wrote to Catherine, which was the name she had given her daughter, at least once a month, an accounting of her own life directed at a child she did not know and could not reach. Margaret had those journals. She had been keeping them since Helen's death. They were in the Leith flat, in a sealed box in the back bedroom, and they had been there for 30 years. And then Margaret wrote the last paragraph, which Frances Cairn read very slowly, and which I will tell you as faithfully as I can remember it. She said that she had told Isla Campbell when she arranged the loan that she wanted no credit and no acknowledgement. She had meant that at the time. But by the end of her life, she had come to believe that the refusal of acknowledgement was its own form of incompleteness, that the decision to erase oneself from a story one had been part of was not humility, but a kind of falsehood. She said she wanted Isla to know that what she had done because she recognized in Isla something she had recognized in herself, a woman of steadiness and capability who was trying to protect the people she loved without making them feel the cost of that protection. She said she wanted Isla to know that this was an admirable quality and also an exhausting one, and that she hoped Isla had found, in the years since, some people she could put the weight down with. She said she hoped the family would find Anne and give her the journals and the property and the story that belonged to her. And she said that if they had trouble finding Anne, there was an address enclosed with the letter that had been current as of the date of writing, though she acknowledged she had no way of knowing whether it would remain so. The address was in Edinburgh, Morningside, half a mile from where we were sitting. Duncan was the one who said, after a silence that lasted long enough to feel permanent and then broke, "We should find her." Fiona said, "Yes." Isla did not speak. She was looking at her hands. Then she looked up, and her eyes went to me, and she said, "I should have told you sooner. I should have told all of you sooner. I was trying to protect the secret, and the secret became the thing I needed protecting from." I reached across the table and took her hand. I said, "You did what Margaret Sinclair asked you to do, and now we are going to finish what she started." Frances Cairn folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. Outside on George Street, Edinburgh went about its business, the Monday morning traffic and the commuters and the ordinary, relentless forward movement of a city that has been accumulating stories for 1,000 years and has developed an extraordinary capacity for continuing, regardless. I thought about layers, about all the things happening simultaneously in a city at any given moment, the love affairs and the grief and the financial crises and the secret kindnesses, all of it occurring in parallel without most people knowing anything about what is happening one floor above or one street across. I want to pause here because I think what was read in that room on Monday morning deserves a moment. A woman spent 20 years keeping a journal addressed to a daughter she had given up and could not find. That is a form of love that most of us will never be required to practice, and I think it deserves to be acknowledged before we continue. If this story is moving you, please leave a like. It tells me that what we are discussing matters. And if you know someone who was adopted or who gave a child up for adoption or who carries that particular form of grief, consider whether they might need to hear something like this today. Share it with them if you think so. There is nothing in this story that will hurt them, and there may be something that helps. Subscribe if you have not yet, and stay with me, because finding Anne is not the end of this story. It is where it becomes something I did not expect. We found Anne on the following Thursday. I will not tell you that the finding was dramatic, because it was not. Frances Cairn contacted the address from the letter, which turned out to be a flat in a converted Victorian terrace in Morningside, and the woman who answered the phone was indeed Anne Drummond, 69 years old now, which none of us had calculated and which stopped us for a moment when Frances mentioned it. The realization that 30 years had passed since Margaret had first opened her door to a woman in her 30s, and that woman was now older than Margaret had been when they met. Anne had been waiting. Not quite waiting in the sense of holding herself in readiness, because she had built an entire life in the decades since, and that life was full and real, and she was not suspended in it. But she told us later that she had never entirely stopped expecting to hear from someone connected to the trust, because Margaret had told her before she died that the process had been set in motion, and that eventually, when the right people could be found and assembled, the letter would be read. She had been patient because Margaret had been patient, and because the quality of patience appeared to run, apparently, in the Sinclair blood. We arranged to meet at my house on Warrender Park Road. This was Isla's suggestion, which I appreciated because she said that if we were going to introduce someone to their family's history, they should do it in a place that felt like home rather than a law office. And she was right. I made soup again and bread, and I put the good cups out, and I put the lamp on because the November afternoon was already dark by 3 o'clock, and at 3:30 Anne rang the bell. She was tall, with the Sinclair jaw that Margaret had mentioned in the letter, though of course I only knew what that meant because the letter had told me. She had white hair cut short, and the quality of someone who has learned over a long life to arrive in a room without filling it more than necessary, which is its own kind of competence. She shook hands with each of us in turn. When she came to Duncan, she held his hand for a moment and said, "Your family helped Margaret in the last years of her life, just by being there." Just by being the kind of people you are. I think she found it comforting. Duncan, who is not a man who shows things easily, had to look away for a moment. We sat down. We told her what had happened from the beginning, from the note in the shoe, from the evening in the lamplight and Isla's hand against the wall. We told her about Robert Mackay in his dark overcoat on the pavement by the meadows, the patient man who had been standing outside a ballet academy for 5 weeks trying to find the courage or the right moment or simply the correct door. Anne smiled at that. She said it sounded entirely like the kind of thing Andrew Patterson would have set in motion, through the most roundabout route imaginable, with perfect eventual success. Then Isla asked, and I could hear in her voice the particular weight of the question, "Did Margaret tell you about the loan?" Anne said yes. She had told her. And she had told her about the condition of the trust, that the dissolution depended on Isla's family knowing the story. Anne said she had thought about this for 20 years, the fact that the resolution of her own inheritance was contingent on the resolution of someone else's silence, and that she had spent time being not entirely at peace with this arrangement before she came to understand what Margaret had intended by it. She said she thought Margaret had designed it that way because she believed that secrets kept in love still cost the people keeping them something real, and she had wanted Isla to be released from that cost even after she was gone. She had tied the two things together because she understood that sometimes people need a formal occasion to put down what they are carrying. Isla sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "She was right. She was entirely right about that." After tea, after the conversation had found its own rhythm and moved through the months and years that Anne had known Margaret and through the family history that was now shared knowledge rather than sealed silence, Isla asked about the journals. Anne had them. She had been given the box from the Leith flat shortly after Margaret's death by the property manager who had been handling it in the interim. She had read some of them. Not all of them, she said, because reading all of them would take a long time, and she had learned to do it slowly, a few entries at a time, at intervals when she was prepared for what they contained. She said Helen Drummond had written with a precision and an intimacy that was, under the circumstances, almost unbearable in the best sense. She said there were entries in the journals that had changed the way she understood her own life, not dramatically, not by providing information she had lacked, but by providing something she had not known she was missing, the sense of being known before she was findable, the sense that someone had been keeping track of her in the only way available. She said she would like very much, when the time was right, to show them to us, if we wished to see them. We said we very much wished to see them. The journals arrived at my house on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, in the same sealed box that Anne had carried from the Leith flat to Morningside, and that had sat in a wardrobe there for 20 years. Anne brought them herself in a canvas bag, arriving at 10:30 with a quality of deliberate care about the way she carried it that told me everything about what was inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the 5 of us again, with Fiona joining us for the first time since the Monday at Francis Cairns' office, and we drank tea and we talked for a while about ordinary things, about the weather and about Fiona's performance, which was now 2 weeks away, and about which Fiona was managing her nerves with the same focused silence she had deployed since childhood, and about Anne's work, which had been in housing design. She had been an architect in a small practice in Edinburgh for 35 years, now retired, and which had left her with a very specific way of looking at buildings, the habit of seeing them as accumulated decisions made by human beings across time. I liked Anne very much. I had liked her from the moment she came through my door, but sitting with her through that Saturday morning, I came to understand the specific quality of her character, the thoughtfulness that was not caution but consideration, the directness that was not bluntness but precision, the capacity she had for sitting with difficult things without requiring them to be resolved faster than they needed to be. These are rare qualities. They are the qualities of someone who has been required, by the particular nature of their own life, to develop a very high tolerance for incompleteness and a very honest relationship with the fact that some things cannot be hurried into clarity. She had grown up, she told us, in a family in Aberdeen who had been entirely open about her adoption from the time she was old enough to understand the word. Her adoptive parents, both now long deceased, had been good people in the way that good people sometimes are, without making a great performance of it. Simply present, simply there, simply consistent, and she had been loved, and she had known she was loved, and she had had a childhood that was, by any reasonable measure, a fortunate one. She said she had always known this, and had tried to hold it alongside the other thing, the fact of the mother she had not known, without allowing one to diminish the other. She said she had not always succeeded at this. She said there had been decades in which the second thing pressed more heavily than the first, and other decades in which it receded almost entirely. And she had come to understand that this variation was simply what it was, not a problem to be solved, but a weather pattern to be lived through. When she had found Margaret in 1993, she had been looking for information, she said, not for feeling. She had wanted facts, names, dates, circumstances, the outline of the biological story. What she had not anticipated was Margaret herself, the particular quality of this woman she had never known, who opened the door of a flat in Newington and said, "Come in," and made tea, and then talked for 4 hours without evasion or apology. She said she had not expected to find someone she liked, and she had not expected how much that would matter. I looked around the table while she talked. Duncan was listening with his hands flat on the table, very still, the posture he has always had when something is reaching him. Isla was watching Anne with the expression of someone who is finding, in a stranger's story, reflections of their own. Fiona had her hands around her cup, and her eyes were bright in the way they get when she is taking something in that she will need time to process. And I thought about the distance between the people in that room, and how much of that distance had not been geography, but silence, the accumulated silence of things not said in the belief that silence protected, and how a folded note in a ballet shoe had crossed it in an evening. I want to stop here, and I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where a story was being told that changed the shape of what you thought you knew? Not a dramatic revelation, not a confrontation, just a story being told that quietly rearranged the furniture. I think many of us have, and I think we underestimate how rare it is to be present for one of those moments with the people we love. Tell me in the comments if you have had that experience. Tell me where you are watching from today. I read all of it, and it matters to me. Leave a like if this is reaching you. Subscribe if you have not yet, because there is a story here every single day, and I promise you every one of them carries something real. Now let me tell you about the journals. Helen Drummond had begun writing in a hardbound notebook in July of 1955. This was 4 months after Catherine was born and placed with the family in Aberdeen. She had titled the notebook on the inside cover in her careful hand, simply, "Letters to Catherine." And she had continued writing in subsequent notebooks, replacing each one when it was full, until her death in 1992, which meant there were 37 years of entries. The box contained 23 notebooks of varying sizes, accumulated across those decades, some thin, some substantially thick, some with dates close together, and some with long stretches of weeks or months between entries. Anne had prepared a small selection. She had gone through the notebooks in the weeks since the morning at Frances Cairns' office, and she had chosen entries she felt would be most meaningful to share with us, and she had transcribed them in her own handwriting onto loose sheets, which she now drew from the canvas bag and placed in the center of the table with the careful movement of someone handling something irreplaceable, which she was. Frances Cairn had not been present for this. This was family. This was the 5 of us, and the November light coming through the kitchen window, and the soup I had put on an hour earlier because cooking is how I manage things that are too large for ordinary stillness. The first entry Anne had chosen was from September of 1955. Helen had written about the autumn coming, about the light changing over Edinburgh, about walking past a pram in the street and having to stop because her legs did not work properly for a moment. She had written, in a tone so matter-of-fact that it was more devastating than any formal grief could have been, that she hoped the baby was well, that the family was good, that whoever was holding her was warm. She had written, "You do not know I exist, but I know you exist, and I will keep knowing it." None of us spoke. The second entry was from 1961, when Catherine would have been 6 years old. Helen had written about a child she had seen in Prince's Street Gardens, a girl with red hair running across the grass, and about how she had thought for one foolish, impossible second and then caught herself and laughed at herself for the thinking, the way you laugh at yourself when you have done something you cannot explain. She had written, "I wonder if you are running somewhere today. I wonder if you like the autumn or the summer better. I wonder what makes you laugh." Fiona had put both hands over her mouth. The third entry was from 1976, when Catherine would have been 21. Helen had written about a young woman she had met at a gallery opening, a friend of a friend, very confident, very quick, and about how she had thought about the age and thought about the fact that somewhere in Scotland or England or anywhere at all, there was a 21-year-old woman who had her eyes and who did not know that. She had written, "I want you to know that I made the only decision available to me. I want you to know that available is not the same as right. I want you to know that I have lived with the difference for 21 years and that I expect to live with it for however many years remain." Duncan looked away. I heard him breathe. The fourth entry was from 1987. George was ill by then, and he would die the following year, and Helen had written in a tone that was quieter than the earlier entries, thinner, as if something that had given the writing its energy was already beginning to withdraw. She had written, "George and I spoke about you last night. We do not speak about you often. It is easier not to. But last night we did. He said he hoped you had been loved. I said that was all I had ever hoped for either. He held my hand, and we did not say anything more, and I think that was the most honest conversation we ever had on the subject, which is perhaps an indictment of our honesty, or perhaps simply a measure of how large a thing it is and how small words are beside it." Anne looked at us. She said, "There are 37 years of them, some shorter than this, some much longer. I have been reading them slowly because they require a kind of attention that I can only sustain for so long at a time. But I wanted to share these with you because you are the people who kept Margaret's memory and who made it possible for me to have them. And because I think Helen deserves to be known, not just as a name on a document, as the woman she was." I said, "She deserves that very much." We sat quietly for a while. The soup was ready. I got up and ladled it out, and we ate at the kitchen table, the 5 of us and Anne, and the conversation moved into gentler territory, into Fiona's upcoming performance and Anne's architecture and the ways that Edinburgh has changed and the ways it has not, and there was something in the ordinariness of it that felt, paradoxically, more significant than the extraordinary things we had just been sitting with. The ability to sit together and eat soup after something large is, I think, one of the most underrated human capacities. It is how we tell ourselves and each other that we are still here, that we are still in the ordinary world as well as the extraordinary one. Before Fiona left to go to afternoon rehearsal, she asked Anne something I had not expected. She said, "Would you come to the performance, if you wanted? I would like to have you there." Anne looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I would very much like that. Thank you." And Fiona said, in the particular tone of someone who has understood something she is still in the process of articulating, "Margaret was a dancer too, and you are her family. It seems right." Anne said, "Margaret would have loved that. She would have absolutely loved that." I want to stop one more time before I continue, because I think what Fiona understood in that moment is worth saying plainly, that the way we honor the people who are gone is not always through monuments or formal proceedings, but through the continuation of what they loved, through the carrying forward of something that mattered to them, through the invitation that says you belong here even though we are only just meeting. If this story has given you that feeling, tell me in the comments what it brought up for you. I want to know. Leave a like. Share this with someone who needs it, Subscribe if you have not yet. There is another story tomorrow and another one after that, and I will be here for every one of them. Now let me take you to the final chapter. The investigation into the trust's formal dissolution proceeded over the following 6 weeks. Frances Cairn handled the legal dimension with the efficiency I had come to expect from her, and Robert Mackay provided the documentation required to confirm the chain of custody and the identity of the beneficiaries. The Lythe property, the tenement on Cardendon Road where Thomas and Catherine Sinclair had brought their daughters up and where Helen had grown from a girl into a woman and where the family history had its physical anchor, was transferred into Anne's name at a ceremony, if a legal proceeding can be called a ceremony, in Frances Cairn's office in December. Anne had been to see the building before the transfer. She had asked if I would accompany her, which touched me, and which I said yes to immediately. We drove to Leith on a grey December morning, the kind of morning that Edinburgh does very well, all pewter light and the smell of the Firth somewhere in the air, and we stood on the pavement on Cardendon Road, and we looked up at the building. It is a solid Victorian tenement, 4 stories, the stone darkened by 130 years of weather, the windows of the upper floors giving onto the street, with a quality of quiet self-containment that I associate with buildings that have housed a great deal of human experience and are used to it. The ground floor was currently occupied by a small graphic design studio whose lights were on inside, visible through the window, people working at desks. Anne stood very still for a long time. Then she said, "I walked past this street once, years ago. I did not know what it was. I remember thinking it was a nice street. I thought about what it means to move through the world carrying proximity to your own history without knowing it. To walk past the place where the people who made you were shaped and to feel nothing specific because you do not yet have the information that would give the feeling a name. It seems to me a very human condition. We are all, in various ways, walking past things that belong to us without knowing it. The work of a life is partly the slow accumulation of that knowledge. The property is being rented out. Anne did not want to sell it. She said she thought she might, at some point, think about what to do with it more specifically, but she was not in a hurry, and the income from the rental was modest and reasonable, and she felt no urgency. I thought this was exactly the right approach. Some things deserve to be held quietly for a while before any decision is made about them. What happened to the ballet shoe itself, you might be wondering? I kept it. Fiona gave it to me when the performance was over. The pair of them, the left one with the loose seam repaired by the company's costume department, and she gave them to me at the cast dinner after opening night with a note that said simply, "This is where it started." I have placed them on the windowsill in my front room, the one that looks out onto Warrender Park Road, where the lamp is. They sit there now in the morning light, pale pink satin gone slightly gray along the toe box with the wear of hundreds of rehearsals, and they are the most improbable piece of personal history I have ever been given. The performance was on the 14th of December. I know the date precisely because I wrote it in the small notebook I had been keeping since November, the one in which I had recorded Robert Mackay's name and the address in Leith and the details of what Frances Cairn had told us on Monday morning in her office on George Street. I had started the notebook the day after I found the note in the shoe. Not because I thought I would need it as evidence, but because I am a historian, and a historian writes things down, and because something in me understood, even at the beginning, that this was a story I would want to be able to tell accurately when I finally had the distance to tell it at all. The last entry in the notebook is from the 14th of December. It says simply, "She danced," and then it says, "We were all there." Let me tell you about the weeks between the Monday in Frances Cairn's office and the night of the performance, because those weeks contained things I do not want to compress into a summary. They contained the particular quality of life that comes after a long concealment has been brought into the open, the slow, and sometimes awkward work of learning how to occupy the same space as one another without the old structure of silence in the middle of it. Isla and Duncan had several conversations I was not party to, which was exactly as it should be, and from what Isla told me afterward, the conversations were difficult in the specific way that conversations are difficult when one person is trying to explain a decision the other person can understand in theory, but still needs time to absorb emotionally. Duncan did not feel deceived, she said. He felt something more complicated than that, a kind of grief for the woman she had been during those 7 years of carrying, the version of his wife who had been managing something alone that she should have been able to share. He said to her, according to what she told me, that he was not angry, but that he wished she had known, even 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, that he was the kind of man she could have brought it to. Isla told me she said she had known that. She said the promise to Margaret had been the structure, not the doubt. And he had held her hand across the kitchen table in the way that people who have been married for 30 years hold each other's hands, without theater, without declaration, simply the weight and the warmth of it. Fiona threw herself into the final weeks of rehearsal with a focus that Rona Gillespie told me afterward was unlike anything she had seen in her in the 8 years she had known her. Not in an anxious way, but in the way of someone who has understood something about why the work matters. I do not know exactly what Fiona was carrying into those rehearsals. She is not a woman who explains her interior life in direct terms. She processes inward and expresses outward through the dancing, which I have always thought is its own form of complete honesty. But I know that she had spent a week reading the entries Anne had transcribed from Helen's journals, had sat with them at my kitchen table over 2 evenings while I made tea and left her largely alone with them. And I know that something in those entries found a place in her that the rehearsals then carried. Her instructor told me her movement in the final week had a quality of emotional authenticity she had rarely seen achieved at that level of technical precision simultaneously. I took that home with me and thought about it for a long time. Anne came to dinner twice in those weeks. The first time was a Thursday, just Anne and myself, because I had suggested to Isla that it might be useful for the 2 of us to have some time to talk, without the particular energy of a full family gathering, and Anne had agreed immediately and brought a bottle of wine from a shop she liked in Brunsfield. We sat at my kitchen table until very late, which is late for a 78-year-old woman, and was probably late for a 69-year-old one as well. And we talked in the way that people talk when they have recently discovered an unexpected kinship with the particular combination of curiosity and recognition that makes conversation feel more like excavation. She told me about her career in architecture, about the specific pleasure of designing spaces for people who would live ordinary daily lives inside them, about the way she had come to think about buildings as accumulated decisions made by human beings across time, which was a way of thinking about buildings that I found genuinely illuminating from a historian's perspective, because it was essentially the same framework I had applied to documents and events. She told me about her own marriage, which had ended amicably in the mid-90s after 12 years, and had left her with 2 adult daughters, both now living outside Scotland, one in Toronto and one in Bristol, and a friendship with her former husband that she described as the best thing the marriage had produced apart from the daughters themselves, which was said without bitterness and with a quality of genuine satisfaction that I found admirable. She asked me about Alistair. I told her about him, about the crosswords and the football opinions and the particular quality of steadiness he had brought to every room he entered, the way certain people anchor their environments simply by being in them. I told her about the last 2 years of his life, when the steadiness had remained entirely intact even as the body was failing, which I still consider the most remarkable thing I ever witnessed. A character so deeply established that it persisted unchanged through the dismantling of the physical container that had housed it. She listened with the quality of attention that I have come to recognize as her particular gift, the full, unhurried attention of someone who understands that being listened to is itself a form of care. I told her that Alistair would have liked her enormously, which was true, and she said that she thought she would have liked him. And we sat with that for a moment in the particular companionable way of 2 older women who have both loved people who are gone and who understand the comfort of being able to say so plainly to someone who does not need the feeling translated. The second dinner was the full family, Duncan and Isla and Fiona, and it was louder and warmer, and the kitchen felt genuinely full in a way it had not felt for several years, which I noticed and stored carefully. Fiona made soup, which she does rather well when she commits to it, and Duncan brought bread from the bakery on Morningside Road, and we sat around the table for 3 hours. There was a moment somewhere in the middle of the evening when the conversation had settled into the easy register that takes time to reach and cannot be manufactured. When I looked around the table at these people and thought about the note in the ballet shoe and the rain on a November Thursday, and the lamp in the front room and Isla's hand against the wall, and I felt something that I can only describe as structural relief. The sensation of a weight that has been present for so long it had become invisible, finally being put down, and the way the room itself seemed to reorganize slightly around its absence. Anne said at one point, after Fiona had asked her about what Edinburgh had been like when she was younger, that she had spent a great deal of time in this city, not knowing that she belonged to it in any particular way, that it had always felt like a city she lived in rather than a city that was hers. She said that this feeling had shifted since September, since the morning at Francis Cairns' office, since the reading of the letter, and she was not quite sure yet what to do with the shift, but that it felt significant. Fiona looked at her from across the table and said, "It is yours. It always was." And the simplicity of it, the direct, uncomplicated generosity of it, made Anne look down at her hands for a moment in the way people do when something has landed more accurately than they were prepared for. Now let me tell you about the night of the performance, because I think it deserves its own space rather than being absorbed into a summary of the weeks around it. The theater was in the city center, a mid-sized venue that the company used for larger productions, with a proper stage and proper lighting rigs and the particular smell that theater spaces have. That combination of old fabric and wood and something electric in the air, anticipatory, like the air before a storm. We had 5 seats together in the dress circle, myself and Duncan and Isla and Anne and Robert McKay, who I had invited because it seemed to me that he had spent 5 weeks standing on a pavement trying to do something right, and he deserved to see what that something had led to, and who had accepted with the quality of formal gratitude of someone who had not expected to be included and was genuinely moved to have been asked. He arrived in his dark overcoat, which I had told him he should wear because it had become a part of the story, and he sat at the end of our row with his briefcase tucked under his seat, and he looked at the stage with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for something to arrive at its proper destination. The work Fiona's company had created was called Marginal Land, which I later learned was a term in geography and ecology for territory that exists at the edge of its own classification, land that is neither fully one thing nor fully another. It was not narrative in the conventional sense. It was not a story with characters and plot in the theatrical way. It was something more like an emotional argument, made through movement and music and light, and what it appeared to be arguing, as far as I could follow it, was something about the territory between what is known and what is said, the space where truth lives before language finds it, or sometimes instead of language finding it. I'm not a person who usually finds herself moved by contemporary dance. I've sat through enough university events and cultural evenings to have developed the skill of appreciating work without necessarily being reached by it. But I will tell you honestly that sitting in that dress circle with my family around me, and Robert Mackay at the end of the row, and Anne sitting between Duncan and Isla as if she had been sitting with us for years, watching my granddaughter move through that light with the particular quality of presence she had brought to those final weeks of rehearsal, I was reached, considerably and without warning. I want to stop here and speak to whoever is listening to this because I think this is a moment worth pausing at. Not the performance, though the performance was extraordinary, but the fact of all of us being there together. The fact that a note in a shoe had made that possible. I know that someone listening to this right now may be thinking about their own family, about something held in silence, about a name not spoken, about a door not yet opened. I would like to know who you are and where you are and what this story has brought up for you. Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, what city, what country, what time of day or night it is there. I read every comment, and I am grateful for everyone. Leave a like if this story has moved you. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet, because there is a new story here every single day, and some of them find exactly the right listener at exactly the right time. And now let me find my place. There is a moment near the end of the work, perhaps 10 minutes from the close, when the stage empties of almost everyone and Fiona dances alone. The music is minimal during this section, almost entirely absent, just the occasional note or phrase of strings, and the light is blue and very still. And she moves through that stillness with a quality that I had never seen her achieve before, or perhaps had never been equipped to recognize before. A quality of embodied truth, of being entirely and without reservation herself in the space. And I thought about Helen Drummond writing in a journal in 1955, "I know you exist." And I thought about Margaret Sinclair opening a door in Newington in 1993, and I thought about a folded note on waxy paper tucked beneath an insole. And I thought that there are forms of love that live so far outside the possibility of direct expression that they find their way into the world through other channels entirely, through music, through movement, through a door opened at the right moment by a woman who understood what it costs to carry a thing alone. The applause at the end was the kind that builds rather than erupts, the kind that means people are responding from somewhere specific and genuine rather than from the social instinct to fill the silence after a performance has ended. Fiona came out with the rest of the company, and she was flushed and entirely present in the way that performers are immediately after the work, that quality of having been somewhere else and just returned. And when she found us in the aisle afterward, she embraced Isla first and held her for a long time, and then Duncan, and then she came to me, and I held her the way I have held her since she was something entirely different from what she is now. And I thought, she is 32 years old. She is whole and she is gifted, and she is entirely herself, and all the small and large decisions made by the people who loved her before she existed have somehow produced this specific woman standing in this specific theater on this specific December night. And there is no mathematics for that, no way to trace it cleanly back to its sources. But the sources were real, all of them, including the ones who were not here to see it. When Fiona was introduced to Robert Mackay, she took both his hands in hers and said, "I know who you are. I am very glad you kept coming back." He said, "I nearly gave up several times. I will be honest with you." She said, "I am glad you did not." And he looked at his shoes for a moment in the way of men of a certain generation who are not used to being thanked directly and find it requires some processing. And then he looked back up at her and said, "Your grandmother is a remarkable woman. I hope you know that." Fiona looked at me and said, "I do know that. I have always known that." The cast dinner went on until midnight, which was far too late for a 78-year-old woman with knees that had strong opinions about December cold, and I stayed for all of it. The legal process concluded the following February. The Sinclair Drummond Trust was formally dissolved and the Leith property transferred into Anne's name, which Frances Cairn handled with the efficiency that had characterized everything we had done through her office since November. There was a final meeting with Robert Mackay at which he presented the last of the trust documents and received our formal acknowledgement, and he shook hands with each of us, and then he picked up his briefcase. That old, well-maintained leather briefcase that had appeared on the pavement outside the Ballet Academy in the dark overcoat on the November evening when I had crossed the road toward him, and he put on his hat and he went out into the February city. And I thought of him walking through Edinburgh with the particular quality of a man who has completed something that needed completing. And I was glad for him. Anne spent a morning in March at the Leith property with a letting agent and with her own solicitor. She had decided to continue letting it, which was the practical decision, and also, I think, the right one for reasons that went beyond the practical. The building had housed her family for 3 generations, and then had held its breath for 2 decades waiting for her, and it did not need to be sold or emptied or repurposed. It needed to continue being what it had been, a place where ordinary life accumulated and was sustained, and the income from the letting was modest but steady and gave her something that connected her to the city in a way she had not expected to find. She went back twice more that spring, once alone and once with her elder daughter, who had come from Toronto for a week. And she told me the second time that she had stood in the back bedroom where the journals had been stored and had felt something she described as the particular quality of a room that has been waiting rather than empty, and that the distinction mattered to her in ways she was still working out how to articulate. I want to pause here and tell you something directly. I have been a historian for over 50 years. I have spent my professional life trying to understand how the past shapes the present, how decisions made in one decade live inside the daily life of the next one, how silence and speech both create real and lasting consequences. I thought when I retired 11 years ago that I was finished with this kind of work in any active sense. I thought I had done my examination of the past and produced what I had to produce and could now occupy a quieter relationship with time. What I did not account for was the past continuing to find its way into the present through channels I had not anticipated. A loose seam on a ballet shoe, a note on waxy paper, a man in a dark overcoat standing in the rain. What I want to say to whoever is listening to this is something quite simple, though it took me 78 years and one November evening in a front room in Marchmont to arrive at it with any real confidence. The things people carry in silence are not made smaller by the carrying. They do not dissolve with time or become irrelevant with distance. They live inside families the way water lives inside stone, invisible until the stone is split, and present always whether visible or not. The silence that protected Ela for 20 years was the silence of a promise made with love and kept with loyalty, and I do not say a word against it, because Margaret Sinclair understood something true about the man my son is and made a decision that served them well for decades. But the silence also had a cost, and Isla was the one who paid it, in the way that the people who protect others usually pay the costs of that protection without anyone formally acknowledging the bill. If there is someone in your life who is carrying something like this, I want to ask you to think carefully about what it would mean to offer them the space to put it down. Not to demand it, not to insist on having access to it. Just to make it clear, through the ordinary daily kindness of how you are with them, that there is room in the relationship for the thing they are carrying as well as for everything else. That is sometimes all it takes. And sometimes it is the hardest thing in the world to offer because it requires you to sit with not knowing exactly what it is until the other person is ready to show you. I also want to say something about the people who do not make it into the stories we tell. Helen Drummond wrote 37 years of letters to a daughter she had given away and could not find, and those letters were never read by their intended recipient, not by the Catherine she had named and lost, but by the Anne who was that child, and who found them 69 years after the first one was written. Helen did not know she would be found. She wrote anyway. She wrote because the love had to go somewhere, because love that is given nowhere eventually becomes something else, something harder and colder, and she was not willing to let that happen. I think about that regularly. The decision to keep expressing love toward someone who cannot receive it is one of the quieter forms of courage I have encountered in this work of trying to understand human beings, and I want to name it clearly, because it deserves to be named. And now I want to tell you about the shoe. Fiona gave me the shoes at the cast dinner after the final performance. She brought them to the table in a small cloth bag, and she put them in front of me without ceremony, the way she does things, directly and without embellishment, and she said simply, "These are yours. They always were." I took them out of the bag. The left one still had the slight mark along the heel where the seam had been repaired by the costume department. A fine row of stitching that was slightly different in color from the original, and which I found more beautiful than the original for that reason, visible evidence of having been broken and mended. The insole was smooth when I ran my thumb along it. The space where the note had been was empty now, the note folded safely in the inside cover of my small notebook, beside the entry that says, "She danced." I carried them home on the night of the 14th of December in the cloth bag on my lap in the taxi, with Duncan and Isla in the back seat beside me talking quietly about something domestic and ordinary. And I held the bag the way you hold things that are simultaneously very small and very large. And outside, the Edinburgh streets went past in the December dark, the stone buildings and the street lights, and the occasional glimpse of the castle up on its rock, which always strikes me as one of the more audacious things human beings have ever built. A fortress at the top of an extinct volcano in the middle of a city, as if daring the world to find them. I placed the shoes on the windowsill in my front room when I got home, the one that looks out onto Warrender Park Road, where the lamp is. I had cleared a space for them because I had known that was where they belonged. They sit there now, the pale pink satin gone slightly gray along the toe box with the wear of hundreds of rehearsals, the repaired seam on the left heel catching the light in the mornings in a particular way that I have come to look forward to, without quite being able to explain why. They are not a monument. They are not a trophy. They are an object that was present at a moment that mattered, and they hold that presence the way certain objects hold the memory of their own history, quietly and without performance, available to whoever thinks to look. Before I come to the end of this, I want to speak to you one more time. I want to speak to whoever has been listening to all of this, through the beginning and the middle and the long, unhurried unfolding of everything in between. Some of you will have listened because you like stories about old women in Scottish cities and the things they find inside their granddaughter's ballet shoes. Some of you will have listened because something in the first few minutes felt like a thing you needed to hear without quite knowing why. Some of you, I suspect, have your own version of this story, your own name not spoken, your own sealed letter, your own man in an overcoat trying unsuccessfully to return something to its rightful place. To all of you, I want to say the same thing, which is this. The past does not become the past simply because time has passed. It remains present inside the structures of our daily lives, inside the silences at family tables, inside the particular way certain names are not mentioned, and certain rooms are not entered, and certain conversations are begun, and then quietly set aside before they arrive at their destination. This is not a criticism, it is a description. I have spent 50 years studying this phenomenon at the level of nations and communities and political movements, and I have spent 11 years since retirement discovering that the same forces operate at the level of a single household in Marchmont, at the level of a folded note beneath an insole, at the level of a young woman who dances in a restored Victorian building off the meadows on Thursday afternoons. What I have also learned, and what I want you to take from this story rather than anything more complicated, is that the moment of disclosure does not have to be dramatic to be real. It does not have to arrive through confrontation or crisis. It can arrive through a loose seam, through a note on waxy paper, through a man who kept coming back to a pavement every Thursday afternoon because he had been entrusted with something that did not belong to him and had not yet found the courage to knock on the right door. The structures of silence can be undone by extraordinarily small things, by one seam giving way at exactly the right moment, if the people who receive the information are ready to receive it. And sometimes the question is not whether the information will surface, but whether the people it surfaces for are the kind of people who will hold it carefully and do something good with it. I believe we were. I believe we are. That is not arrogance. It is simply what I observed. Now, I want to ask you to do something for me. If this story has reached you in a way that matters, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, what city, what country. Tell me whether it is morning where you are, or evening, or the middle of the night. Tell me if there is someone in your own family carrying something in silence, and tell me what this story made you think about them. And if you know someone who might need to hear it, someone whose family is holding something that has been held too long, please share it with them, not because I think a story can solve what silence has created, but because sometimes the right story, at the right moment, gives people permission to begin a conversation they have been circling for years without finding the door. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet. There is a new story here every single day, and each one carries something true at its center. because that is the only kind of story I know how to tell. Leave a like if this one found you. I am grateful for every person who sits with these stories, more grateful than I know quite how to express. And to mark the end of this particular story, I want to ask you to leave one word in the comments. Only one. The word I am asking for is found. If you have listened all the way to this point, if you have followed the note from the shoe to the law office, to the theater, and back to the windowsill on Warrender Park Road, then you know why that word is the right one. Not because everything was solved, not because 25 years of silence was undone in a single evening, but because something that had been lost inside a family's history for a very long time was finally, by the accumulated small, courageous acts of several people who cared more about truth than about comfort, brought home. Margaret Sinclair believed that honesty always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it has been buried. She spent her life holding that belief, and then she arranged her affairs so that it would prove itself true even after she was gone. I think she was right. I think she was right about that, and about a great many other things. And I think Isla has thought the same thing every morning for the past several months when she walks into the front room on Warrender Park Road and sees a pair of pale pink ballet shoes on the windowsill catching the winter light. The note was not hidden inside a shoe in the end. It was hidden inside our family's history, and it had been waiting there, patient and exact, for someone to kneel down on a wet Edinburgh pavement and find it. Thank you. From the bottom of this old woman's heart, thank you for listening.